Hello and welcome to McKillop Library Online. This is Alicia Vandering, and today we're going to be doing a brief APA workshop to talk about some basic APA formatting as well as how to create in-text and full citations. I want to start off by talking about what our goals are for this workshop. First, we want to understand why we cite. Second, we're going to identify some basic APA formatting rules for title pages and running heads. And then finally, we're going to identify how to create in-text and reference citations in APA format. Now, whenever I offer citation workshops, one thing I really like to start with is asking the question, why do we cite? When I'm in the classroom, a lot of the responses I get tend to revolve around, we want to avoid plagiarism, we want to give credit to others' words and ideas, and those are both excellent reasons to cite. However, in addition to this, when we cite, it also allows us to better support our arguments, to support our thesis. And then it also allows us to acknowledge a body of literature that's been done in research on our topic that we're now adding to or supplementing and building on. One great question that I tend to get in return then is, why are there so many different styles for academic writing and citations? For example, you might have worked with MLA before, you might work with Chicago or APA. This is a great question. So a lot of this does come down to tradition. It's really nice when you're a scholar in a field to know that the research you're looking at is all going to be cited in a similar way, because it means you know where you want to go to get different types of information. So this tends to be why we have these different styles. As we're getting started, I want to share some important resources for APA. We're just going to be scratching the surface today, so I want to leave you with places to go when you have questions in the future. So first of all, of course, we need to mention the publication manual of the American Psychological Association, which is now in its 7th edition. So that is what everything is based off of. That's your holy grail of your citation and formatting work. However, there are many other resources that you can use in addition to this. There's a lot of universities that have online writing centers that have come up with guides for APA. Purdue OWL is one of the most popular ones. I've also really liked using Excelsier's OWL, so I put that link on here too. And then finally, the APA style blog is really fantastic to go to as well. Sometimes you'll get kind of bizarre citations that you have different bits of information for, especially if you're working with online sources. And the style blog is really great to help you answer some of those questions. So let's go ahead and get into creating a running head and some basic formatting. Now, I'm going to show you an example in a minute for what a running head is going to look like on your actual paper. But for now, I wanted to tell you that a running head is essentially a heading at the top of each page of your paper that gives a shortened version of your paper's title. This is something that should be created by the author of the paper. In APA, the shortened version of your title has a max of 50 characters, and that includes punctuation and spacing. So you're going to want to keep that in mind as you're working on your running head. Now this is what your running head and your title page formatting is going to look like for your actual paper. So let's start by talking about the running head. So if you look in the top left corner of these pages, you'll see that there's title of paper. That's your running head right there. You'll see it's in capital letters. It's under 50 characters. And it's also supposed to be in the same font and the same font size as the rest of your paper. Now, if you look to the right side of each page, you'll see that there's a page number. Your page number 1 should be your title page. Also on the title page, centered in the middle of the page, you're going to have the title of your paper, your name, and your institution. Occasionally, professors will also like you to include additional pieces of information, like maybe their course name, maybe the date. So always check in with your faculty member to see what they're looking for there. Now, I would really love to be able to show you how to create this. Unfortunately, every program is different and it will change according to what version of the program you have, whether you're using it on a Mac or a PC. So this makes it really challenging to showcase how you create something like this. However, you can always check in with your librarian or someone at your writing center, and they'll help you and walk you through these steps to create this document. Usually you can also go to Google and you can search for creating an APA header and then write whatever program you have, and it'll walk you through those steps too. Now we're going to switch gears and start to talk about creating in-text citations. In APA format, in-text citations are required for direct quotes, for paraphrasing, and for summarizing. Now, direct quotes, of course, are when you're taking word for word what another author or creator has said. You're enclosing that in quotation marks. When we're looking at paraphrasing, on the other hand, you're taking something that someone else has said and you're putting it into your own words. Usually when you're paraphrasing, you're working with a couple sentences, maybe a couple paragraphs. And that's important because when we look at summarizing, when you're summarizing, what you're doing is you're putting things in your own words, but you're looking at a much larger section of another author's work. So you might be looking at summarizing several pages or summarizing an entire article or chapter of a book. So that's where some of those distinctions lie. Now, when you're using any of these types of sources in these ways, you're going to always include the author and the year of publication in your in-text citation. However, if you're working with direct quotes, you also have to include the page number, or if you were working with an online source, use the paragraph number instead. When you're working with APA citations, you have a couple different options for how you can create your in-text citations. In your first option, you can list the author's name first. The way that you do this is you introduce the author's name and you follow that by the date in parentheses. If you're working with a direct quote, remember those you're going to need that page or the paragraph number for, you're going to put that information in parentheses at the end of the sentence, right before the period. I want us to examine what this might look like. So if you look here at our direct quote, we have, in the day the crayons quit, the author has the crayons insult each other. For example, Drew Daywalt, and then in parentheses we have our publication date of 2013, has the orange crayon write to Duncan saying, I see yellow crayon always talk to you, the big whiner. And then in parentheses we have page 19, because that's the page that this is taken from. Now, if you're working with one page that a quote has come from, you use a P and then a period, it's lowercase. If you were taking a quote from multiple pages, you would do two P's followed by a period and then your page range. Now, if you're doing a paraphrase here, we'll see the beginning starts out very similarly, and then we go into, for example, Drew Daywalt, and then in parentheses 2013, has the orange crayon criticized the yellow crayon for its whining. And we don't need any page or paragraph number here because we have paraphrased it. Let's take a look at our second option for in-text citations. Now in this option, you're going to put the author last. So you're going to put the author's name and the publication date at the end of the sentence with parentheses around them. Again, if you're working with a direct quote, you're going to have to add the page or the paragraph number in there as well. So here's a couple examples of what that can look like. So with our direct quote, in the day the crayons quit, we're working with the same information here. The author has the crayons insult each other. For example, when writing to Duncan, orange crayon says, I see yellow crayon already talked to you, the big whiner. And then in parentheses, we have all of our citation information. So we have the author's last name, a comma, 2013, that's the publication year, and then we have our page 19, and then we close our parentheses and have the period. If we're paraphrasing, all we do is we leave off that page section that was at the very end. I often have students ask me, how do you know when to use one option over the other with how you're using your in-text citations? Usually it's up to the writer themselves. So I sometimes will use the author first option for when I'm first introducing a new author, or sometimes if it's a big thinker in the field, I'll list their name within my text itself. And then in later mentions, I'll put them all in parentheses at the very end. This will be up to you. It'll depend on how it seems to flow with everything else that you're writing. Some other information you might want to keep in mind too as you're doing this. So we gave examples where there was only one author that was being cited, but often you'll have two authors or more than two authors even. If that's the case, you connect them with an and if you were referring to them within your actual text, or you use an ampersand, which is that and symbol in your parenthetical citation. It's going to look like this, just to give you an idea. If you're working with three or more authors, what you'll do is you'll use the first author's last name, and then you use et al., which stands for and others. And you do that whether you're working in the text itself or if you're working in your parentheticals at the very end of your sentence. If you're citing multiple works in parentheses, what you want to do is you want to separate them by semicolons. So for example, if you had two different works by Drew Daywalt that you were citing, one of them maybe had two authors and one just has one, you'll see that there's a semicolon that falls between those two works. When you're looking at what you use between individual pieces of information from just one source, remember that you only want to be using commas in this case, whether it's between the author and the publication year or the publication year and the page number. It's just going to be commas if it's coming from the same source. And then finally, like I mentioned before, if you're citing multiple pages, make sure to use PP with a period after it instead of just one P. So now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty. How do you craft those full citations for your reference page at the end of your paper? When you're doing in-text, we're using just smaller pieces of information from the work, the author's name, the publication date, and those are the pieces of information that will lead your reader to your reference page where they can find all the other information on your sources. We're going to talk specifically about doing books here and doing articles as well. And these are just a couple examples of what the finished product is going to be looking like, so you know what we're working towards as we work through how you craft each piece of information here. Now, before you start crafting your full citations, you want to take a few minutes and make sure you have all the information you need for all your sources. Make sure that you have the authors of all your sources. Remember, some of your sources might have more than one author, and you want to make sure you have all of their names. You want to get the date of publication for your sources. If you're working with books, also make sure you have the title of the book and the publisher. When you're working with articles, you're going to need the title of the article, the page numbers, and the DOI, which is its digital object identifier. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And also you're going to remember that your articles are coming from journals, so you're also going to need the journal title, the volume, and the issue numbers. If you make sure you have all this information in the beginning, it's going to make creating your citation so much easier as we move forward. We're going to start out by talking about how you format authors' names for your citations, and we do this because that's always the first piece of information that you list in your citation, whether you're working with a book or an article or a website. So if you have one author, what you do, as you can see in that first blue row box there, is that you put their last name first, follow it with a comma, and then you put the first and middle initial. Or if there's not a middle initial, you just do the first initial. So if you have the whole first name of your author, you're still going to shorten that down to just their initial. You never want to use the full first or middle names when you're working with APA citations. When you have 2 through 20 authors, what you're going to do is you're going to follow that same format we just talked about for your first author, and then you'll follow their initial with a comma, and you do the same format for the second author. So you do the last name, comma, first and middle initial, comma, and you proceed on. And then you only change that before you get to the very last author of your source. You're going to put an ampersand. So that's our and symbol there. Now, this does change if you're working with more than 20 authors, which before I even go into this, I want to say this isn't very common to have more than 20 authors. I honestly don't think I've ever worked with a source that had more than 20 authors, which is why for my example here, I've had to pull from Harry Potter characters. But if on the off chance you get more than 20 authors, you list the first 19, and then you, before that, or right after that 19th initial, you're going to put a comma, and then you put an ellipsis, so 3 periods, and then you skip all the way to the last author, and then you do their last name, comma, and their first and middle initial. So if you had 25 authors, you would only list the first 19, and then you would do the 25th. For after you've done your authors, you're going to follow that with your publication year. So you're going to just put that in parentheses and put a period after your in parenthesis. So if you're working with an article that's given you a month or a month and a day that it's been published, if it's a scholarly article, you're still going to just bring that down to only the year itself. This is only going to change if you were working with a newspaper article or if it was a magazine that came out several times a month, like something like Time magazine. In those cases, you'll put other dates on there too. But generally, you're just going to be working with the year when you work with a journal. So let's go ahead and wrap up how you would do your book references. So we've done the author, your publication year, and then after that, what you would have is your book title. When you're doing your book title, you're going to italicize that. And then this gets a little weird when you're first getting started. The capitalization rules for titles are kind of interesting in APA. So when you do your book title, you're going to capitalize the first word of the title, the first word that comes after a colon, and proper nouns. Everything else will be lowercase. After your book title, you're going to put a period at the end of that. And then the last piece that you put when you're doing your book citation is the publisher. So you're just going to simply write the name of the publisher, follow it with a period, and then you're done if you're using a print book. So I've put an example here on the bottom so you can take a look and see how those pieces fall together. One thing you'll notice here is notice that the first line of the citation is flush with the left margin, and the second one has what we call a hanging indent, where it's indented 1/2 inch from the left margin. This is what you're always going to want to use when you are doing your citations. All right, so now we're going to jump and talk about how you finish the rest of an article citation. So remember, we started out with our authors, and then we had our publication year. And now we want to talk about how you wrap the rest of it up. So the next thing that you would list in an article citation is the title of the article. So when you're working with article titles in APA, you don't use any italics or surrounding quotation marks. The capitalization is going to follow the same rules that we used for books. So you're just going to capitalize the first word of the title, the first word after a colon, and proper nouns. And you follow this with a period. Down below here, you can see a couple examples. You see recent trends in research, a methodological essay, and only recent and A are capitalized here. In the second example, you'll see that Canadian is also capitalized, however, because it's a proper noun. Now, when we move to working with journal titles, which is what falls right after the article title, don't worry, I'll show you an example in a few minutes of how this all fits together. Your journal titles you want to italicize, and in this you're actually going to capitalize all your major words like usual. And this is going to be followed by a comma, and you can see a couple examples down there below. So let's go ahead and walk through the other elements that we need to wrap up the article citation. So we've just come from doing the journal title, which was italicized and followed by a comma. After that, you're going to have your volume number, which you'll see is also italicized there. You'll also notice that it doesn't have volume or vol in front of it. It's just the number that you want. This is immediately followed by your issue number, and that goes in parentheses and is not italicized. Also, if you look really closely, you'll note that there's no space between the volume number and the beginning parenthesis around the issue number. This is exactly how it's supposed to be. You do not want to have a space there, and that's one of the things that's commonly missed when people are new to APA. After your in parenthesis, after your issue number, you're going to have a comma, and then you put in your page numbers. So unlike when we did the in-text citations and we used a P or a PP when referring to pages, when we do our page range for the full citation, we only want the numbers here. And then those we're going to follow with a period. So our last piece that we're going to put in is our DOI, our digital object identifier. I'm sure you've been waiting with bated breath to find out what that is. So just like ISBNs tend to link to physical books, your DOI is going to link you to articles and even sometimes ebooks now as well. So ideally you'd be able to take a DOI for an article, you could put it into a search engine and it would immediately come up with the article you were looking for. You probably wouldn't be able to see it in full text, but you'd be able to see the bibliographic information for it. So DOIs, we're going to put them at the very end of our citations and you'll see there's no period after it. Now, to make this a little bit complicated, there are two different formats that DOIs have generally been created in. The first earlier format was that they were only strings of numbers. So if you're looking at like where this arrow is pointed up towards the 10 and the numbers that follow, that's typically what DOIs used to look like. However, we're moving into systems where we add that HTTPS and that link information before the numbers. In the new edition of APA, our 7th manual that we're using now, the correct format for a DOI is to always put the https://doi.org/mark before you have the number. So if you come across a DOI for an article you're using that only has the number, you have to manually input that HTTPS string in before it. It's a little bit complicated, but I think as we move forward, we're going to see most DOIs being made this way, so hopefully the situation will eventually right itself. Like I said, you're not always going to have a DOI for an article. If you're working with an article that you found from an academic research database, like something from the library, and there's no DOI, then you don't have to put anything in the spot here. However, if you're working with an article that you got from a website, you're going to want to put the link for the article in here. And you'll do just like we've done here, you're going to remove the hyperlink for that website if you're using an article from a website. And I did want to show you again how this is all looking when it's pulled together. So if you look at the bottom, you're seeing our example. We have an article that had, it looks like 5 or 6 different authors here. We follow that with our publication date in parentheses, the title, and note the capitalization here. It's only racial that's capitalized and implications. That's followed by the journal title, the volume and issue number, the page range, and then finally that DOI. And there's no period after that DOI. So that's what it's going to look like when it's all together. So as I'm wrapping up, before I send you on your merry way to make many a citation, I want to give you a few general notes for your reference page. And you'll see on the right side here, I've kind of given an example of the start of a reference page at least. So first of all, your reference page in APA is always going to be titled References. If you've worked with MLA, it was Works Cited. In Chicago, it's Bibliography. But when we're working with APA, it is always References. You are always going to center that on the top of a new page. So if your final page of your paper ended halfway down, you always are going to jump to the next page, and that's where you start your reference page. You're going to use bold font for references. Now, I've mentioned, I think a couple times in here that we're using a new edition of the APA manual. The 7th edition just came out in October of 2019. This bold font is something that's new in this new edition. The way that you organize your sources is going to be by the first author's last name of your source. So the very first name that's listed in your citation itself. I do want to mention with this, I always have this great question that I get from students about if you have a source that has several authors, do you alphabetize the names within that individual source? And the answer to that is no, you don't. You always leave it in the same order that the article listed in. And we do this because authors agree amongst themselves what order they want their names to appear in, and we honor whatever system they've established there. Your entire reference page, just like your paper, should be double spaced. And you'll see that our example is doing that there. And then also it's using the hanging indent that we talked about before. So you'll see that each citation, the first line is flush with the left margin, and then the subsequent lines are all indented by 1/2 inch. Any program that you use to create your paper and your reference page is going to have an option to make this hanging indent. Usually I recommend that students use like the help search bar and just type in hanging indent, and it will usually bring you to what you need to in order to do that hanging indent. It's always better to do this rather than pressing enter at the end of each line and then indenting 1/2 inch. It just works much better. If you're working with links, it doesn't break up your links. If you go to do this and you're having trouble with it, definitely let a librarian or somebody at the Writing Center know, and we'll help you figure it out. Well, that is all I had for you for our workshop. I hope that you have learned a lot about why we cite and how we cite both for in-text and with our full citations. Definitely reach out to me if you need help with anything. I'm more than happy to help out, especially if you get any tricky citations going on. All right, well, have a wonderful day, and thank you for your time.